Amidst the clamor of life and the crashing waves of human emotion, a person often finds themselves a prisoner of their own reactions, chained by anger, fear, or resentment. From here, Stoicism emerges, not as a call for emotional numbness or suppression, as is often falsely assumed, but as a profound practical methodology for achieving emotional liberation. It is the philosophical art that teaches us how to build an impenetrable inner fortress, where we observe the outside world with clarity while possessing absolute sovereignty over our responses. In this pursuit of freedom, we learn that true control does not lie in subjugating others or altering the conditions of the world, but in holding the reins of ourselves and in our deep understanding of what falls within our circle of control and what lies outside it. Silent bullets in ownership, between the bitterness of emotion and the wisdom of presence. In this journey of liberation, silence emerges as a double-edged sword. Here we must carefully distinguish between two types of silence: silence as a poisoned, silent bullet, and silence as ownership and presence. When silence stems from bitterness, a sense of injustice, or a repressed desire to punish the other, it transforms into a silent bullet. This type of silence is not liberation. Rather, it is a masked, passive-aggressive emotion. It is an internal noise that tears its owner apart before it even reaches the other person. In this state, a person remains a slave to the situation and to the individual who provoked them, allowing the actions of others to dictate their psychological state. In stark contrast stands the Stoic concept of silence, a broad, responsible practice that embodies absolute presence. Silence here is ownership. You own your internal space and consciously choose not to pollute it with futile arguments or reckless reactions. This noble silence does not stem from weakness or escapism, but from latent strength and a complete awareness of the present moment. It is a silence rooted in wisdom, reflecting emotional stability and the ability to contain a situation without getting entangled in its drama. When you are silent with a sense of ownership, you are powerfully present, observing, evaluating, and conserving your energy for what is truly worthwhile. Establishing boundaries. The decisive word before the refuge of professional silence. While mindful silence is a refuge and a strength, employing it, especially in professional relationships, requires preceding wisdom. Stoicism does not advocate for passive withdrawal or allowing others to cross our boundaries without warning. Rather, it calls for justice and courage in expression. Before transitioning to what can be termed simple silence, which is ceasing emotional engagement or excessive arguing with colleagues or superiors, it is crucial and necessary to clearly remind the other party that boundaries exist. In the workplace, silence should not be a trap we set for others. It should be the logical consequence of crossing pre-established lines. Proper Stoic conduct requires the following from you: clear and emotionless declaration. Express your professional and personal boundaries using precise, calm, and direct words. For instance, saying, "This style of communication is unacceptable to me," or "My job responsibilities end here." Transitioning to simple silence as a preventive measure. Once you have clarified your boundaries, fulfilled what duty and logic dictate, and lifted the burden of explanation from your shoulders, only then, if the other party continues to overstep, does resorting to simple silence become the most eloquent and professional response. At this stage, professional silence transforms into an insulating barrier that protects your inner peace. It deprives the transgressing party of the emotional fuel they seek to consume from you, ultimately affirming your absolute sovereignty over yourself and your professional space. The sacred gap, the art of pausing at the moment of impact. Continuing our journey in building the inner fortress and having understood when to remain silent and how to draw our boundaries, we arrive at the true testing point, the initial moment of impact. Emotional liberation in Stoicism is not tested during times of ease and tranquility. Rather, it manifests in that fleeting moment when we receive a hurtful word, a provoking situation, or a sudden disappointment. Here, between the feeling of pain and the reaction, exists a delicate temporal and psychological space, a hidden gap that the wise call the space of freedom. The true Stoic realizes that the initial feeling of pain or anger is inevitable and biological, an involuntary emotion imposed by our human nature. However, what happens immediately after this feeling is what determines whether we are masters of ourselves or slaves to our emotions. Pausing in this gap and expanding it is the practical essence of emotional liberation. The deception of the ego and the firmness of character. To understand the importance of this pause, we must dissect the conflicting forces within us at the moment of provocation, the struggle of ego versus character. When exposed to an irritating situation, the ego immediately flares up. The ego is a fragile entity, driven by the fear of diminishment and thirsty for self-validation. Therefore, it demands a reckless and immediate reaction. It pushes you to shout, to reply with a harsher word, or to make a rash decision that grants you a false, temporary sense of victory. This reckless reaction is, in reality, an obedient servant of the ego. It blinds us to the consequences and drags us down to the very level of the provocation, only for us to find ourselves later apologizing for words we did not mean or regretting actions that tarnished our image. In contrast stands the concept of character, the steadfast moral and value-based foundation that a person has sculpted through their awareness and wisdom. A conscious and measured response is a loyal servant to this character. When we pause, we silence the noise of the panicked ego and allow character to take the helm. Character does not seek momentary victory. Rather, it seeks virtue, an action that aligns with our principles regardless of the ugliness of the external situation. Delaying the response is a declaration of reason's sovereignty over instinct. It is what makes us free human beings, not merely biological machines responding to stimuli with conditioned reflexes. The chemistry of control. Instant cooling. Techniques. To transform this philosophical concept into daily practice, Stoic heritage and psychological logic offer us practical mechanisms to control the ember of anger before it burns us. Here are the most important instant cooling techniques that widen the gap between pain and response. 1. Conscious withholding, the art of restraining. Tongue and body. The first physical response to pain is tension and a readiness to attack. The withholding technique means issuing a voluntary command to your body to physically stop. It is a moment of voluntary freezing, keeping your lips sealed, relaxing your fists, and taking a deep, slow breath. This simple physical restraint sends a reverse signal to the brain that the threat is not lethal and that there is no need to release a flood of stress hormones. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus emphasized that the first challenge is, do not let the initial impression sweep you away, but say to it, wait for me a little. Let me see who you are and what you represent. 2. Sedimentation or deliberate delay. Just as impurities, sediment, settle at the bottom of a cup if we let the water still, so do emotions. Heated emotions carry a host of intellectual impurities and random assumptions. Through the technique of postponement or deliberate delay, we give our emotions enough time to settle, allowing the mind to clear once again. The Roman philosopher Seneca, in his famous essay on anger, uttered the immortal phrase, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." It is perfectly fine to say, "I will reply to this email tomorrow," or "I need a few minutes to process what you just said." This delay is not a weakness. It is the strategy of a warrior who refuses to fight on the terrain chosen by their opponent. 3. Planned catharsis, pre-birth, the emotional incubator. This technique is one of the most profound philosophical metaphors. Imagine that your reaction is an embryo in the process of formation. Anger wants to birth this embryo prematurely and deformed, hurling it into the faces of others. Stoicism teaches you to keep it in an emotional incubator. Planning for pre-birth catharsis means processing toxic emotions and expelling them in a safe spot, accepting the other as a cosmic truth, detaching from the illusion of potential. Having established the pillars of the inner fortress and learned how to widen the temporal gap between provocation and response to protect ourselves from the recklessness of the ego, we now move to the most complex arena in the path of emotional liberation: other people. A significant portion of our psychological depletion does not stem from the direct actions of people, but from our desperate resistance to their reality and our refusal to accept them exactly as they are. Stoicism teaches us a harsh yet liberating lesson. The Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius reminded himself every morning that he would encounter ungrateful, selfish, and deceitful people. Not to be pessimistic, but to arm himself with the acceptance of human nature exactly as it is, without embellishment or denial. Emotional liberation is completed when we stop putting people on trial based on scenarios we have written in our own minds and begin dealing with them based on the factual data they present to us every day. The trap of expectations and the mirage of the ideal version. One of the biggest traps we fall into in our relationships, whether personal or professional, is betting on potential. We often do not fall in love with a person or befriend them based on who they are now, but based on who we believe they could be if the right conditions were met, if we gave them more love, or if we put extra effort into fixing them. This emotional gamble is the antithesis of Stoic wisdom. When you bet on someone's potential, you are actually rejecting their reality, living in a constant state of waiting for a future that may never arrive. Here, you tether your inner peace to the transformation of another person, something that lies entirely outside your circle of control. The person before you is not a work in progress awaiting graduation. They are a complete entity with their current characteristics. If they offer you coldness, harm, or indifference, Stoic acceptance dictates that you view these traits as solid facts, just as you accept that fire burns and ice is cold. Expecting a thorn bush to bear apples simply because you tend to it is a form of philosophical naivety with which you punish yourself. True liberation begins when we honestly say, "This is who this person is. These are the limits of their emotional and moral capacity, and I accept this truth without trying to falsify it." Sufficiency and redirecting the compass. Searching for new sources. Once we accept the reality of others and cease betting on their hidden potential, an important question arises. What do we do with our legitimate human needs for respect, appreciation, or support? The Stoic answer lies in not monopolizing your sources. It is a fatal mistake to make a single person, especially if they are emotionally unqualified or abusive, the sole provider for your psychological needs. When you realize that the well you are drawing from is dry or poisoned, continuing to dig in it is not patience, it is self-destruction. The compass must be redirected towards seeking new, healthy sources. This manifests on two levels: the internal source, self-sufficiency, 𝗿𝗄𝑘𝐴. Finding your worth and self-esteem in your virtues, your work, and your commitment to your principles so that you do not become an emotional beggar awaiting crumbs of approval from someone who does not value you. Multiple external sources, expanding your circle of relationships, engaging in supportive communities, building new friendships, or even immersing yourself in a passion or hobby that gives you a sense of achievement. When your sources of strength are diversified, the abusive or negligent person loses their ability to emotionally starve you. 𝗃𝗀𝗃, the temporary mask of virtue, dissecting the abuser's sudden change. On the path of accepting people as they are and detaching from them, we may encounter a highly complex and dangerous psychological phenomenon, the sudden and temporary change of the abusive person. When you begin applying Stoic philosophy, when you remain silent with ownership, draw your boundaries clearly, and stop betting on the abuser's potential while demonstrating your emotional independence, the abusive or toxic person senses their loss of control. In a desperate attempt to regain their status and tighten their grip once again, they resort to a deceptive tactic, a radical, sudden change. Suddenly, the cruel person transforms into a gentle being, and the dismissive one becomes attentive, showering you with kind words and sweet promises. This change is not a moral awakening, nor is it a reflection of the potential you long bet on in the past. Rather, it is often a manipulative tool known in psychology as love bomb. Dismantling the court of others, the ultimate liberation from the authority of opinion. After fortifying our walls and learning how to accept others as abstract realities, far from the illusion of potential, we arrive at one of the fiercest battles on the path of emotional liberation. A battle fought not against bodies or actions, but against invisible ghosts, the opinions and perceptions others hold of us. The inner fortress we have built through mindful silence and a safe distance remains threatened with collapse if we leave its doors wide open to the winds of external evaluation. Stoicism confronts us here with a radical truth. As long as you tie your self-worth or inner peace to what people think of you, you remain a willing slave in their court, handing them the keys to your cell every morning. True liberation is complete when we break these invisible chains and declare our final withdrawal from the game of crowd-pleasing. The mirage of external justice and the trap of correcting the image. One of the deepest human instincts that flatters and feeds the ego is the feverish desire to be understood correctly. When we are subjected to injustice, misunderstanding, or a deliberate distortion of our image, an urgent need to plead our case rises within us. We consume our energy, our days, and our inner peace in a desperate attempt to correct our image in the eyes of those who misunderstood us, or in search of an external justice to vindicate us before the public. Stoicism describes this endeavor as a tragic depletion of life. Why? Because another's opinion of you falls entirely outside your circle of control. The emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius marveled at this, saying, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." When you desperately defend your image before someone who has already decided to misunderstand you, you grant them an authority they do not deserve. Truth does not need a desperate lawyer, and virtue does not beg for applause. Seeking justice from people who lack fairness is like seeking warmth from a block of ice. The Stoic realizes that the only justice they possess is their justice with themselves, ensuring their actions and intentions align with their principles. If this internal alignment is achieved, what the external world thinks turns into worthless noise. The highest degree of emotional maturity manifests in practicing what can be called the art of allowing others to misunderstand you, to smile calmly and continue on your way, leaving them the freedom to adopt the distorted version they have fabricated of you, because you realize with piercing insight that your image in their minds is a reflection of their own complexes, fears, and limitations, not a reflection of your truth. Between freedom from opinion and constructive ignorance, the philosophical fine line. Here, a dangerous ambiguity arises that must be dismantled. Freedom from the opinions of others can be falsely interpreted as a call for arrogance, turning a completely deaf ear to any criticism, or adopting a hostile attitude that says, "I don't care about anyone." This condescending withdrawal is not Stoic liberation, rather it is an inflation of the ego in a different form, and it deprives a person of the opportunity to grow. Therefore, Stoic philosophy brilliantly distinguishes between blind indifference and the conscious practice of constructive ignorance. True liberation does not mean building a deaf wall that isolates you from the world. Rather, it means installing a fine filter at the doors of your consciousness. This filter operates according to the following sorting mechanism. 1. Dismantling criticism, extracting gold from the mud of insult. Constructive ignorance means listening to what is said not to suffer, but to analyze. When faced with harsh criticism, the Stoic strips the words of their toxic emotional charge, tone, malicious intent, mockery, and searches for the objective truth hidden within. If a spiteful person tells you bluntly, "You are careless in your work and always late," the ego will be angered by the rudeness and reject the statement entirely. However, the Stoic mind practicing constructive ignorance completely ignores the speaker's intent and rudeness, because that is their problem, and extracts the abstract information. Am I really late? If the answer is yes, they use this poisoned criticism as fuel for personal growth and course correction. Here you have transformed the stone of abuse into steps to elevate yourself. 2. Returning rotten goods to their owners. On the other hand, if words pass through the filter and turn out to be mere fabrications, opinions not based on reality, or psychological projections from the noble withdrawal, choosing distance before the spread of resentment. After building the walls of our inner fortress, training ourselves to rein in our emotions, breaking the chains of absurd expectations, and freeing ourselves from societal inquisitions and the opinions of others, we now arrive at the moment of practical reckoning. What if, despite all this intellectual immunity, remaining in a specific environment or with a certain person continues to be an endless drain? Here, Stoic philosophy presents us with a courageous and strict choice, choosing distance as a top priority before resentment devours us. The battle for emotional liberation is not always a battle of endurance and staying on the front lines. Often, the highest expression of strength is to turn your back on the toxic arena and walk away in peace. Resentment, the rust of the soul and the slow poison. Why do we consider choosing distance a necessity and not a luxury? To answer this, we must understand the nature of resentment. Resentment is not merely fleeting anger. It is suppressed anger that has rotted over time. It is a state of chronic bitterness that forms when we force ourselves to remain in a harmful environment or a draining relationship, under the illusion that our endurance is a virtue, when in reality, it is a betrayal of ourselves. When we refuse to create a safe distance and continue to bear more than we can handle, resentment turns into a rust that eats away at our soul from the inside. We become vindictive, cynical, and burdened with grudges. The Stoic philosopher realizes that resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Therefore, the ultimate goal of Stoicism is not to teach you how to endure harm with foolish patience, but how to protect your moral compass from distortion. Here, distance emerges as a protective shield, guarding you against turning into a deformed, bitter version that resembles those who hurt you. Early withdrawal, the pinnacle of self-compassion, not surrender to weakness. There is a common societal fallacy that associates withdrawal with weakness or defeat. It is planted in our minds that the strong one is the one who stays, fights, and endures to the last breath. But the Stoic mind brilliantly dismantles this fallacy. Early withdrawal is an act of pure self-compassion, and it is conclusive proof of maturity, not an indicator of weakness. When you realize, thanks to the insight you have developed, as discussed in previous chapters, that a relationship or situation will not change and that your continuation only means further emotional bleeding. Making the decision to walk away early is the peak of wisdom. The weak is not the one who withdraws. The weak is the one who is terrified by the idea of leaving, thus remaining stuck in the swamp of harm out of fear of the unknown or fear of people's judgment over their withdrawal. The strong, however, is the one who possesses enough self-respect to say, "This place is no longer worthy of my inner peace, and I refuse to be a sacrifice in a temple that does not recognize my value." Early distance prevents the accumulation of wounds and preserves whatever energy you have left, allowing you to invest it in spaces that enhance your growth and flourishing. The philosopher Epictetus repeatedly warned his students, "Do not mix with mud and then expect not to get dirty." Early withdrawal is a categorical refusal to dive into the mud, the ghost of guilt, the deception of the savior complex. However, as soon as we make this courageous decision and begin to implement distance, whether physical distance through complete separation or emotional distance by minimizing contact to the bare minimum, a new deceptive internal enemy attacks us: guilt. The mind begins to weave booby-trapped questions. Did I rush it? Did I abandon them in their time of need? Am I a selfish or cruel person? This feeling of guilt does not stem from an awakened conscience. Rather, it is a byproduct of the savior complex we have been programmed with. We have been deluded into believing that our responsibility toward others supersedes our responsibility toward ourselves, and that our goodness as individuals is measured by our ability to sacrifice our comfort to fix someone else's affairs. This belief completely contradicts Stoic principles, because it burdens you with weights that lie outside your circle of control, namely, changing the other person or saving them from themselves. Dismantling guilt with Stoic logic, the art of self-exoneration. To deal with and dismantle this feeling of guilt, Stoicism offers us precise surgical tools to restore our awareness after making the decision to walk away. 1. Rearranging the pyramid of duties. You are your first project. Stoicism does not negate one's After making the courageous decision to withdraw and choose distance, and after successfully dismantling the false sense of guilt, we might imagine that the battle is won and the inner fortress is fully secured. However, a final trap often lies in wait, a trap of profound cunning because it disguises itself in the cloak of logic and the pursuit of understanding. The urgent need for final explanations, known in contemporary psychology as closure. The fiercest storms that strike our emotional stability after the end of a relationship, whether professional, a friendship, or romantic, do not always come from the fact of the separation itself, but from the manner in which it ended. When the curtain falls abruptly without a final dialogue, without a vindicating apology, and without clear answers explaining why what happened, we find ourselves trapped in an infinite mental waiting room. Here, Stoic philosophy intervenes to awaken us from this agonizing slumber, asserting that waiting for closure from others is, in truth, a voluntary surrender of our emotional freedom, and a return to placing chains in the hands of those we have just escaped. The illusion of the sealed script and the absurdity of waiting for an apology. We are meaning-seeking creatures, and our minds are programmed to tell stories. We want every story to have a beginning, a climax, and a tight, logical conclusion where all knots are untied, just like in novels and movies. We want the person who hurt or failed us to sit before us, look into our eyes, admit their mistake, explain their motives, and offer an apology that restores the moral balance of the universe. But the Stoic truth, harsh yet liberating, is this: life is not a novel, and others are not actors working according to a script we wrote. When we tether our inner peace to the condition of obtaining an explanation or an apology, we commit the supreme Stoic sin, binding our happiness to something that lies entirely outside our control. How can you wager your psychological tranquility on a word that a person may or may not utter, a person whom experience has already proven lacks maturity, courage, or fairness? The need for a smooth emotional cutoff with the other party's blessing is merely an illusion manufactured by the ego, which refuses to accept defeat or absurdity. The true Stoic accepts that some chapters end with a sudden tear in the page, not an elegant period at the end of the line. Emotional liberation is completed when we realize that we do not need anyone's permission to close the door, and that not receiving an apology is, in itself, a sufficient answer, revealing the true mettle of the person far more than 1,000 polished words of regret ever could. Experience as a self-sufficient proof, interrogating silence. How then do we satisfy our minds that starve for answers? Stoicism teaches us the art of sufficing with the data provided by the experience itself. You do not need a final conversation to understand why a friend betrayed you, why your manager marginalized you, or why someone suddenly vanished from your life. A final dialogue is often filled with justifications, half-truths, and emotional manipulation. Instead of searching for missing words, look at the actions standing before you. The experience itself, in all its harshness, has already given you all the data you need. Absence is an answer. Ignoring your messages is an explanation. Continuing to cross your boundaries despite your warning is a final statement. Their behavior at the end of things is the closure you seek. The Stoic mind gathers these factual points, analyzes them with detachment, and extracts the lesson. If the experience has taught you that this person does not respect your space or lacks the courage for confrontation, then this is the cognitive gift of the experience. Taking this valuable information and moving forward is a victory. Remaining in a state of waiting for them to acknowledge this information is self-enslavement. Their function in your life ended the moment they provided you with this lesson, and what remains of the healing process is your responsibility alone. You are the one holding the pen, and you are the one who writes the final line. I have realized their truth, and this is enough for me to walk my path. The prison of ambiguous loss, the torment of open ends. Despite the strength of this philosophical framework, we must admit with human humility that application is not always easy. There is a type of ending that creates a deep fissure in the architecture of the soul, known as ambiguous loss. This occurs when someone suddenly vanishes from our lives without justification, ghosting, or when a deep relationship is severed without any prelude or comprehensible reasons. Ambiguous loss is one of the harshest psychological experiences because it places the mind in a perpetual state of emergency. There is no search, ceasing to excavate memory, mindfulness, and breaking the cycle of psychological rumination. In the previous chapters, we fought fierce battles to secure our external borders. We built the fortress walls with mindful silence, trained to curb our emotions in the face of provocations, accepted others as abstract realities, freed ourselves from the chains of societal courts, and possessed the courage to withdraw and move forward even in the absence of explanations and sealed endings. On the surface, it seems we have achieved victory and that the sources of external pain have been severed. However, the traveler on the path of emotional liberation soon discovers a terrifying truth. What if the enemy has already infiltrated the walls? What do we do when our true tormentor is not the person who wronged us and left, but our own minds that refuse to let them go? Here we arrive at the deepest and most complex levels of Stoic philosophy and psychological practice, the battle against the internal trap called psychological rumination, and the absolute necessity to strictly and immediately halt the continuous mental replaying that tears wounds wide open. Dissecting the double pain, the physical knife and the dagger of imagination. The great Stoic philosopher Seneca encapsulated this human tragedy in a timeless and profoundly accurate phrase when he said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." To understand this phrase, we must distinguish between primary pain and secondary suffering. When you are subjected to abuse, betrayal, or loss, that is the real physical event. It is a primary wound with a specific time frame. It happened and ended in the past. As for what happens later in the long sleepless nights and moments of distraction, when you replay the memory tape, summon the hurtful tone of voice, and imagine the crushing responses you should have said but did not. This is the mental wound that you tear open yourself. The human body and the nervous system cannot distinguish between a real threat standing before the eyes and an imagined threat projected by the mind. Every time you ruminate on the painful situation, your brain releases the same stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Your heartbeat accelerates and you feel a tightness in your chest, exactly as if the incident were happening right now. The abusive person may have hurt you once in reality, but through psychological rumination, you grant them the authority to hurt you thousands of times in your mind. Ceasing to mentally reopen the wound is not merely a piece of advice for comfort. It is the cessation of an ongoing process of self-destruction. The deception of problem-solving and the mechanism of automatic thoughts. Why does the mind insist on torturing itself? Why do we slip into the vortex of rumination despite being aware of its pain? The reason lies in what can be termed automatic thoughts. The human mind is biologically designed as a problem-solving machine that monitors threats to ensure survival. When we experience an emotional trauma or an unresolved situation, as we discussed in ambiguous loss, the mind classifies this situation as an open file or an unresolved threat. In a desperate attempt to understand what happened and protect the self from its recurrence in the future, the mind activates a continuous analysis mode. It deludes you into believing that by thinking deeply and continuously about the details of the situation, you will arrive at a hidden wisdom, change the past, or find peace. But this is a grand illusion. Psychological rumination is not a constructive analysis of the problem. It is an absurd spinning in a hamster wheel. It entrenches negative emotions, deepens the sense of helplessness, and creates a state of analysis paralysis that prevents you from taking a single step toward the future. The guard at the gate of the mind, distinguishing between the intrusive thought and voluntary engagement. Stoicism does not demand the impossible of you, as it fully realizes that humans do not possess a stop button to prevent thoughts and memories from flowing into their heads. The first automatic thought that invades your consciousness, suddenly remembering a hurtful situation while drinking coffee, is an involuntary idea, falling outside your circle of control, and you are not philosophically held accountable for it. However, the true Stoic challenge begins the very second after the thought appears. Distress and entanglement and rumination occur when you invite this thought to sit down, serve it coffee, and converse with it for hours. Here, the matter transforms from an automatic biological event into a voluntary choice and an implicit agreement to host pain. Emotional liberation requires you to appoint a strict guard at the gate of your consciousness, what the Stoics called prohairesis, or conscious will. The job of this guard is to inspect thoughts the moment they appear. The job of this guard is to inspect thoughts the moment they appear. When a ruminative thought emerges, inviting you to reopen the wound, the guard must intervene and say, "We have already exhausted this file, and there is nothing new to extract from it but pain. I will not allow you to occupy my mental space at this moment." Mindfulness, the shield of the present against the ghosts of the past. The practical tool for applying this Stoic concept and the most effective weapon to tame the mind's automatic laws is the technique of mindfulness. Mindfulness is often misunderstood in popular culture as merely an attempt to relax the nerves or completely empty the mind of thoughts, which is biologically impossible. In the philosophical and emancipatory context, mindfulness, which strikingly aligns with the Stoic concept of 𝗵𝗇, or continuous attention, is a process of strict discipline. It consists of the voluntary directing of the lens of focus toward the present moment with complete acceptance and without passing judgment. It is shifting attention away from the dark cinema screen playing the tapes of the past to the direct physical reality happening here and now. How do we use mindfulness as a tool to nip rumination in the bud? Here are the profound applied mechanisms. 1. The riverbank observation technique, cognitive diffusion. Instead of being a part of the thought and drowning in the details of the painful situation, mindfulness trains you to take a step back and become an observer of your thoughts. Imagine your mind is a flowing river, and ruminative thoughts are leaves floating on its surface. Do not jump into the river to wrestle with the leaves or swim after them. Instead, sit quietly on the bank and watch them pass by. When a thought strikes you, "He mocked me and treated me incredibly unfairly," rephrase it using cognitive diffusion and tell yourself, "I am noticing right now that my mind is producing a thought that says he mocked me and treated me unfairly." This simple linguistic modification strips the thought of its absolute authority. It transforms it from an absolute and inevitable truth into a mere temporary neurological phenomenon occurring inside your skull, making it easier to let it go without getting emotionally entangled with it. 2. Grounding in the physical present. Psychological rumination is an hijacking of your consciousness, forcing it to time travel into the past. The strongest response to this hijacking is to force consciousness back into the present through the senses. When you feel the vortex of rumination beginning to swallow you, use immediate grounding techniques. The breath anchor. Direct your sharp attention to the physical sensation of air entering and exiting. The mind cannot focus on a complex physical sensation in the present and think about the past with the same efficiency at the exact same moment. The 5-4-3-2-1 rule. Look around you and consciously notice 5 things you see, 4 things you touch and feel their texture, 3 things you hear right now, like the sound of a fan or a bird, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you taste. This intense sensory engagement sends an emergency stop signal to the part of the brain responsible for producing past scenarios, forcing it to process the data of the safe, physical present. 3. Intentional redirection of energy. Redirecting focus. Once you have detached yourself from the thought through observation and grounded yourself in the present through the senses, a crucial step remains: filling the void. The mind abhors a vacuum, and if you do not provide it with a task in the present, it will return to excavating the past. Use the energy of mindfulness to immediately redirect your focus toward a positive action within your direct circle of control. Immerse yourself in a complex task that demands concentration, such as reading a philosophical book, writing code, solving a math problem, or engaging in a strenuous physical workout. Here you are transferring neurological activity from the centers of emotional memory to the centers of executive function and achievement. Ceasing to mentally reopen the wound and taking control of automatic laws is not a one-time event. It is a continuous daily practice, akin to training the muscle of willpower. Every time you refuse to be dragged behind rumination, and every time you redirect your attention to the present through mindfulness, you build a new layer of resilience around your inner fortress, affirming that while the past may have left a scar, it has completely lost any authority to make you bleed anew. The architecture of an impenetrable life. Inner construction and dismantling the centrality of the other. In our long and arduous journey toward emotional liberation, we have transitioned from establishing external boundaries through silence to taming primary emotions, arriving at the grueling internal battle against the vortex of psychological rumination. When we succeed in halting the bleeding of memory and silencing the noise of the past through mindfulness, we find ourselves standing in a calm, yet seemingly empty internal space. This emptiness is the most delicate moment in Stoic philosophy. If we do not fill it with active construction, the past will return to occupy it once again. From here, we transition from the phase of defense to the phase of constructive offense. The ultimate goal now is not merely to repel annoyance, but to transcend it by engineering a complete, solid, and fulfilling life. A life no one possesses the luxury to disturb or derail. It is a process of radical energy redirection, where every drop of attention that was wasted on draining individuals is withdrawn, to be poured into the molds of self-construction and strict routine, ensuring that any human being, no matter how close or abusive, ceases to be the sun around which the planets of our lives revolve. The danger of the single pillar and the collapse of the emotional structure. Why do some people possess the power to destroy us with a word or disturb us with their absence? Stoic philosophy answers with harsh mathematical clarity. Because we have made them the single pillar upon which the structure of our lives rests. When your source of happiness, your self-esteem, or even your daily routine is tethered to one person, you place the entire architecture of your life into the hands of a fickle human being, prone to change, error, and departure. Emotional liberation requires demolishing this fragile design and rebuilding a multi-pillared structure. The person whose influence you seek to break free from, whether a competitive colleague, an arbitrary boss, or a toxic relationship, must be stripped of their central status. They must be left with nothing but a marginal space where their presence or absence does not affect the stability of the overall structure. This detachment is not achieved merely by a mental decision. It demands tangible, physical action on the ground, manifesting in the creation of interests, responsibilities, and goals that transcend this person by vast distances. Routine as a Stoic shield, physical and intellectual discipline. The most formidable Stoic shield that makes your life impenetrable is a strict and systematic routine. Routine is not boredom, it is organized freedom. It is the skeleton that carries your days and protects them from collapsing under the weight of moods or emotional disturbances. When you dedicate your energy to building your self-competence, no empty space remains in your mind for trivialities or side conflicts. This construction manifests in two parallel paths. 1. Physical discipline as an anchor for the soul. The inner fortress cannot stand if the body housing it is weak or neglected. Building physical strength is the truest expression of self-mastery. When you commit to a solid training regimen, such as systematically dividing your days between push, pull, and leg workouts, and strictly tracking your progress to increase lean muscle mass and reach precise weight goals, you send a powerful message to your mind. I control my development and I build my resilience gram by gram. This continuous physical discipline, coupled with the meticulous regulation of nutrition, creates a sacred daily rhythm that no external turbulence can break. In the gym, before the heavy weights, the noise of others evaporates, leaving nothing but the sound of your breath and your free will. 2. Intellectual immersion and technical production. The second path to filling the space of life and rendering it impervious to disturbance is diving deep into the seas of knowledge and complex production. The human mind thrives when confronted with difficult analytical challenges. When you immerse yourself for long hours in deciphering complex data, diving into the logic of algorithms, and building programmatic matrices with precise and rigorous languages, or when you plan the architecture of integrated digital platforms and manage real tech projects, you shift the center of gravity in your life from emotional chatter to creation and innovation. A mind engrossed in debugging a stubborn programmatic error or drafting a plan to launch a digital project is a mind completely fortified against nonsense. Dedicating time to learning new skills and developing professional competence turns your personal growth into an ongoing project that swallows all your energy. It leaves anyone trying to disturb you standing outside your walls, powerless to capture your attention, which is now entirely directed toward elevating yourself. Forging a social support circle, from the bond of wounds to the bond of virtue. While we focus on self-construction and individual routines, Stoicism warns us against slipping into harsh isolation. Humans are inherently social creatures, and replacing a pathological dependence on one person does not mean abandoning people altogether. Rather, it means re-engineering your circle of belonging in a healthy and conscious manner. The problem with our old circles is that they are often built on habit, shared complaints, or fleeting geographic proximity. To build a life that cannot be disturbed, the liberated energy must be invested in forging a new social support circle grounded in what the Stoics call virtuous friendship and mutual development. Communities of competence and growth. Instead of begging for attention from people who drain you, direct your social compass toward environments that propel you forward. Seek companionship among those who share your intellectual and practical passions. Engaging with peers in rigorous academic circles, being present in developer and programmer communities, or even building solid relationships with gym training partners. All of this creates a network of relationships based on mutual respect and the exchange of benefit and knowledge. These individuals do not care for emotional drama. Rather, they share your language of concrete goals and projects. Cultural roots and authentic identity. Just as strength is drawn from the future and from growth, it is also drawn from deep roots. One of the most powerful ways to build social and psychological support is by connecting with heritage and authentic identity. When you dive into the depths of your local history and connect with individuals who appreciate the pure linguistic and cultural legacy, such as a deep interest in the authentic 𝗃𝗃𝗃 dialect, according to its precise historical nomenclatures, like 𝗃𝗃, and studying the history and symbols of the region's tribes, you build a belonging that transcends fleeting individuals. This connection to the land and history grants you a sense of continuity and groundedness, making you realize that you are part of a vast civilizational fabric, neither alone nor breakable by the mere stumbling of a superficial relationship. Diversifying emotional assets. Just as in the world of investment, where putting all your capital into a single stock is financial suicide, Stoicism invites you to diversify your emotional and social assets. Have friends for philosophical discussions, friends for work and project development, friends to share hobbies with, and family ties maintained with healthy boundaries. When the sources of positive interaction in your life are multiplied, the collapse or corruption of one source never leads to the collapse of the overall structure. Building this fulfilling life, rooted in a strict personal routine and surrounded by a genuine social and intellectual support circle, is the greatest and most elevated response to any attempt at disturbance. At this stage, you no longer need deliberate ignorance, because ignorance becomes the natural consequence of your genuine preoccupation with the beauty and grandeur of what you are building. You simply no longer have the time nor the mental space to look back. Self-sovereignty and the invincible fortress. At the conclusion of this philosophical and practical journey toward emotional liberation, we clearly realize that Stoicism is not merely a shield behind which we hide from the cruelty of the world or the disappointments of relationships. Rather, it is a living compass that constantly guides us back to the only space over which we possess absolute control, ourselves. Together, we have traced the path of building the inner fortress stone by stone, starting from owning silence as a power and a presence, and moving through widening the sacred gap between provocation and response to protect our character from the recklessness of the ego. We learned how to accept others as abstract realities without betting on the mirage of potential, and how to dismantle the courts of public opinion to free ourselves from the crowd-pleasing syndrome. Through the courage of early withdrawal and the dismantling of the false sense of guilt, we realize that we do not need permission or a final apology to close the doors of the past. With mindfulness, we sealed the entryways of psychological rumination, ultimately reaching the highest degrees of liberation, engineering a solid life, replete with discipline and work, and surrounded by a genuine support circle, rendering it completely impervious to breach or disturbance. Emotional liberation, in its ultimate essence, is not the absence of pain or the numbing of feelings. Rather, it is the profound certainty that whatever lies outside your will holds no authority to destroy you. It is to stand amidst the shifting storms of life, calm, rooted, and the absolute master of your inner kingdom, walking the path of your virtue and growth with a free insight, waiting for justice from no one, because through awareness and action, you have already done justice to yourself.